have rights as a taxpayer if your data is compromised. And let's try to figure out both where these findings came from and what you can do now. Brandon Arnold is with us now. He is the Executive Vice President of the National Taxpayers Union, a taxpayer advocacy group pushing to limit taxation and spending. Thank you so much for joining us. How exactly did this investigation come about, and what was the impetus for this?
Yeah, it's interesting because actually a lot of this information came out last year. November of last year, a website called The Verge released a really groundbreaking report, an investigative report looking at this very problem. And essentially what happened was Pixels, which is kind of like a tracking system that groups like Facebook, companies like Facebook and Google put on the internet in various places. Usually they're pretty innocuous. You go to a Chicago Cubs website, for instance, there's a pixel there that picks up on why you're looking at that information. And then when you go to another website, you might get an ad for a Chicago Cubs hat because they know you have some interest in that baseball team. Now, those pixels found their way onto these websites that are run by H&R Block and other tax prep services. That's a huge problem because that information is not just a Chicago Cubs baseball hat. We're talking about private taxpayer information that should not be shared from these private companies to one another. So that's the huge problem here. Again, this was originally uncovered back in November, but now they're shining some additional light with this congressional report that was just released.
Yeah, I'm more of a Sox fan, so but that's neither here nor there. I do appreciate you breaking down the Pixel situation because that was a big part of the reporting. What kind of information were they sharing and what for? And before I freak out, how does this compare to the kind of information that's already being shared with other companies online?
Yeah, there's a tremendous amount of information that is shared on the internet every time you log on. I think you kind of alluded to that already, Christian. And the exact nature of this information that was shared on these websites is still something that needs to be investigated further. It does appear that the number of dependents that people had, income information, all that information could potentially have been passing from hands to hands. But the question there is this aggregated information? Is this individual information that's attached to Social Security numbers or other forms of identification? I think this is just the beginning of an investigation that's really, really important here in order to protect taxpayer privacy. The gravity of the situation really can't be understated because taxpayer privacy is so very important. And I think getting to the bottom of this is a matter that's not just going to involve Congress, who ran this investigation, or The Verge that initially unearthed some of this information, but other arms of the federal government.
Mm-hmm. I'm curious to know, how are these companies reacting to this revelation? Have we heard from H&R Block or TaxAct or TaxSlayer about, this reporting and this revelation? What have we heard from them?
Yeah, so when this information originally broke, this news story broke back in November, a lot of these companies took action. So the problem today isn't nearly as bad as it was late last year. That means they took down these pixels in some instances or turned them down so they wouldn't be collecting sensitive information. So the problem isn't as acute as it once was, but it still remains a problem, and I still think that investigation is warranted. And the other thing is we need to make sure that we don't have any type of identity theft or other problems that stem from this release of information. So we need to make sure that information isn't public in the hands of ne'er-do-wells that are using it to, for instance, file erroneous tax returns in somebody else's name. This is a huge problem that has really exploded during the pandemic, not just with regard to filing fake tax returns and trying to get people's refunds, but people are filing fake unemployment insurance claims, all sorts of other benefits they're trying to tap in to steal from other individuals, not just domestically, but we have international actors that are doing the same. So it's a huge problem here, and this is just another log on a fire that's been burning, unfortunately, for a while. Unfortunately, it's been the IRS, too many instances, that has leaked their own information. They've put information on their own website that was private in nature, left it there for over a year in some instances, exposed information that should have never been subject to private scrutiny. We had the ProPublica release not long ago, that was 2 years ago, where they released tax returns from a number of billionaires and other wealthy Americans. So we've had all sorts of data theft and identity insecurity that's taken place. Sometimes the IRS has been the culprit, and here we have two private entities that appear to be doing things that they really shouldn't be doing.
Mm-hmm. Who's doing the investigating here, and what sort of punishment could be in store for these companies for sharing this data with Meta?
So it's unclear who exactly is going to investigate here. Certainly the Department of Justice could be in play, the Federal Trade Commission, the FTC, the IRS itself. I think there are a number of entities that need to look into this, and how law enforcement handles it remains to be seen. But there could be potentially criminal penalties here if you have people that are willfully passing information from one entity that shouldn't have it to another entity that shouldn't have it. There is the potential for criminal activity. So I think we absolutely need to shine a very bright spotlight on this. And the investigation needs to be very, very thorough. Now, the authors of this report want to go even further than that. They want to essentially shut down tax preparation services as they exist. I think that's a measure that's far too aggressive here. In fact, if you look at the report, before they even get into the question of identity theft, before they even start to pull back some of the information that's taken place here with these websites and these tax prep services, they make a pitch for their own bill to have the IRS perform tax services for individuals rather than having HR&R Block and other services doing so. So I think there's a little bit of a political advocacy play that's going on with this report. I'd rather remove that political advocacy and just advocate on behalf of taxpayers to make sure that their privacy and their data is protected and only in the hands of people that ought to have it.
Yeah, speaking of taxpayers, I'm sure a lot of folks are going to be watching this and thinking, what can I do to better protect our data? I mean, personally, I'm not going to be paper filing anything, but I'd also like to not have to worry about where my data is ending up. What are my options here?
Well, there are basic things that you can do, even calibrating your website settings on your browser to make sure you're not necessarily leaving behind information when you bounce from website to website. Now, sometimes that does provide convenience, like when you want to get back onto a website, you were doing some shopping, left a few things in your cart, you come back to that website the next day and they're still there. So there are matters of convenience. But if you want to be very aggressive, you can start to ratchet down that information that you're leaving behind when you browse the internet. You can do things like be more aggressive about changing your passwords on a regular basis to make sure people aren't accessing your information, aren't getting on websites in your name. And then the IRS has a website called identitytheft.gov that you can visit if you do believe that you are the subject of some form of identity theft. You can start to create your own personal plan to address that and rectify that situation. On a personal note, I can tell you several years ago, I had my identity stolen. I had somebody file a tax return in my name. And fortunately, I was able to rectify that situation. But it's a huge headache, and I don't wish that on even my worst enemy.
Yeah. Brandon Arnold, Executive Vice President of the National Taxpayers Union.